I was starting to hint at a concept of great clinical importance, which is an abnormal mass accumulating within the unyielding skull and putting pressure on nearby structures. That can cause a herniation. And that term has come up a few times already. I know it came up on Tuesday, actually. A hernia is simply a displacement of tissue from one spot where it's supposed to be into another place where it's not supposed to be. Okay, that's what a hernia is. And within the brain, herniation can be, or within the cranium, herniation can be lethal. It's very dangerous. So why would herniation occur? Well, there's a couple of different reasons. You could have an inflammatory process where there's some kind of infection, for example, and the inflammation causes swelling, and that causes herniation, displacement of tissues. You can have a hemorrhage, just like we saw with that big hematoma that was accumulating, that epidural hematoma. It's pushing stuff from right to left, right? Herniating tissue. You could have a tumor, a slowly developing mass from a cancerous tumor can put pressure on nearby structures and cause them to herniate. And here's the trouble with herniation within the cranial cavity. So consider a herniation due to pressure placed here on, say, the right cerebral hemisphere. Let's say there's a big bleed right here, like our epidural hematoma, or there's a tumor forming in the bone or whatever. A big amount of pressure, a large pressure put on the right cerebral hemisphere in this case, is going to push it and cause it to, it's going to drop down with the pressure, and eventually it might try to sneak around this big dural fold right here. And if you push the right hemisphere of the brain down against this big dural fold, all the way down so that it starts to scrape along the underside of it into the space occupied by the left cerebral hemisphere, well, number one, you're kind of crushing the right cerebral hemisphere, which is, the brain's going to be offended by that, and that's going to cause all kinds of trouble. Number two, as the brain scrapes across that sharp dural fold, it can be damaged by that. And there are other dural folds, and there are other places. For example, the foramen magnum at the base of the skull. If you put pressure on the top of the brain and force the entire brain downward, you can get a herniation of tissue through the foramen magnum, and that can damage that tissue. That can damage the brainstem, which is typically has very dire consequences, like death. So herniation is a critical clinical scenario, and it's one we really want to avoid, especially inside the cranium, because of the high likelihood of severe, potentially lethal damage to these sensitive neural structures. I'll stop there and see if anyone has any questions about herniation.
We do have another question. The brain, the midline looks a bit squished to the right after the hematoma. Does that bounce back to normal after?
Thank you for pointing that out. So I felt it right. So as I said, this epidural hematoma is really obvious here. That's not the only thing that's abnormal. Notice that there's kind of a vague white line here. That's indicating a dural fold. It should be centered, and it's kind of leaning over toward the left because it's being pushed from the right. And then here, these darker spaces, those correspond to cerebral ventricles. Those are fluid-filled spaces, cavities within the brain. We'll talk about them in a little bit. And they should be nice and midline. They should be symmetrical about the midline. They're being squished and shoved all the way over to the left. This is a disaster. This is a bad epidural hematoma. It's putting tremendous pressure on the right cerebral hemisphere, displacing everything to the left. You've got brain tissues kind of scraping along the edges of dural folds here, and it's going to damage them. So this is an absolute clinical emergency, and you need to relieve the pressure. So this epidural hematoma is putting all this pressure on the brain and causing herniation. You need to relieve the pressure. And right off the top of my head, I mean, there are medications that you can apply. A surgical procedure would be to just simply remove a piece of the skull and relieve the pressure by opening the skull and letting some of it come out. So there was a politician in Arizona, a senator in Arizona, Gabrielle Giffords, I think, was shot, and she had massive increase in intracranial pressure. They removed a portion of her skull surgically, emergently, to relieve the pressure. Sonny Bono, so he's also a California politician, actor, singer, died from exactly this. He smashed into a tree and died from a hemorrhage and intracranial pressure due to an accident skiing. There was a famous model many years back in Europe. I think she was in Switzerland skiing. She had the same problem. She fell or hit a tree or something while she was skiing. Had a bump on her head, went to the local clinic, She seemed okay. They sent her home. She died like a couple hours later because this was developing slowly but surely. The protocol is to keep them there, do a scan, make sure they don't have a hematoma. Here's our quick title of this lecture is brain. There's one whole slide on the brain with 6 bullet terms. So here we go. Let's give it to do. So the brain has cerebral hemispheres, right and left, and they are divided. At least the outer part of them is divided into lobes, major regions, and they're named just like the related bones of the cranium. So that's why we went over those bones. So up in top and kind of toward the back, there's a parietal lobe. Among other things, the parietal lobe houses the region of cerebral cortex in which we perceive our sense of touch. So primary somatosensory cortex. Remember, that includes touch, temperature, pressure, pain, a whole bunch of other stuff. It might be this strip of cortex right here. It's hard to tell without doing physiological study, but that might be a good estimate. So that's the parietal lobe where primary somatosensory cortex is located. There is a large frontal lobe in the human brain. Lots of important things go on there: executive function, aspects of our personality, also primary motor cortex. So our sense of touch is perceived here. Commands down to skeletal muscle to say grab a cup of coffee like that. Those come from primary motor cortex, and that's in the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe. Okay, so here's my demo for the day. Notice my fist, holding it as my right hand. Got my right thumb sticking up to the side. You can think of the brain kind of like this shape. The thumb here projecting off to the side, that's like the temporal lobe right there. So the brain kind of looks a little bit like a boxing glove almost. There's a thumb sticking out on the side. That's the temporal lobe. This would be our frontal, parietal, occipital lobe is going to be back there. Okay. It's hard to follow that uterus demo. Here's the temporal lobe. It's got, among other things, perception of hearing occurs here, so primary auditory cortex. There are also a whole bunch of critical structures in the medial part of the temporal lobe, kind of deep in there, that are responsible for memory and learning. So as I say these things, as I talk about the functions of these different structures in the brain, you should be thinking to yourselves, well, what would happen if you damaged it? Well, in this case, if you damage the temporal lobe, you might have trouble hearing, you might have amnesia, and trouble learning. The occipital lobe, way at the back of the brain here, that's where we make the movie of our lives. So that's where we perceive vision, back there. There's a structure, a little brain down here. Cerebellum means little brain. This structure is responsible for coordination of complex voluntary movements and the learning of complex voluntary movements. So, and by complex voluntary movements, I mean, throwing a frisbee, riding a bike, something like that. Problems with the cerebellum could lead to clumsiness, lack of coordination, and difficulty learning, new complex motor tasks. The brainstem. What can we say about the brainstem? A lot of really important basic stuff goes on in the brainstem. Most of it's under the radar, like control of heart rate and respiration. Your state of arousal, that is how alert and awake you are, is a function of brainstem activity. So you can be awake and aroused normally. You can be lethargic. You can be stuporous. You can be in a coma, and then you can die. And that's what happens with successive damage to the brainstem and loss of arousal.